Hello and welcome to this webinar on working together to drive down international transport carbon emissions. It's been organised by EU-UK Forum in partnership with UK Transport in Europe. EU-UK Forum, as you probably know, was launched a couple of years ago to facilitate a dialogue between EU and UK government, civil society and industry, and it's played a key role in the last couple of years bringing people together to foster a constructive dialogue. And this is part of that ongoing series of events and initiatives to allow that dialogue to continue. It's focusing on that very important issue of trying to drive down international transport carbon emissions, and that's why UK Transport in Europe are involved. The voice of UK Transport in Europe, and one of their priorities is to contribute to the zero carbon agenda for transport by at least 2050. It's great we're joined by a very diverse and strong panel of guests today. If I could just introduce them briefly. Firstly, Simon Argyle from the Department of Transport, who's the Deputy Director of Europe and Better Regulation. Good morning, Simon. Julia Poloskanova, who's the Senior Director at Transport and the Environment, T&E for Vehicles and E-Mobility. Welcome, Julia. And we have Ian Catlow, the Head of Office at London's European Office. Welcome, Ian. Rachel Everard, Head of Sustainability at Rolls-Royce. Welcome, Rachel. And finally, Robert Cook, the Policy Director at the Railway Industry Association. And they're all going to try and tackle this challenge that we have. It's hard to believe it was less than a year ago when COP26 entered into some very ambitious commitments to drive down international transport carbon emissions. Seems like a long time ago because, of course, since then, we've had the terrible situation in Ukraine with the Russian invasion and the resulting energy and economic crisis. I think for many of us has taken the focus away from that COP26 agenda, understandably perhaps, but with COP27 just around the corner, it's important that we refocus more than perhaps ever before, given the crises that we face in Europe and indeed across the world. And I think all of us know the only way we can bring down carbon emissions is that we don't just take unilateral action, it has to be joined up action, UK, EU, and indeed, as we saw at COP26, internationally too. We're all in this together, we must all work together. And I think the other strong view of UK Transport in Europe is that we've got to be better at doing this across the modes. We all often seem to approach these things mode by mode, aviation and shipping, then road, then rail, often forgetting the important active travel modes of walking and cycling and others. We're very keen to promote a debate about intermodality because, again, really we're only going to see our ambitions delivered if we have an intermodal approach to transport decarbonizations. It's got to be international, it's got to be intermodal. But obviously we'd welcome the thoughts of our experts and panelists this morning to hear what you have to say. And I do urge everyone on the call today, the webinar, to put your questions and comments into, and we'll try and take as many of them as we possibly can within the hour that we have. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the first panelist. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and it's a delight to be on this seminar and speak on behalf of the Department of Transport in the UK. As Mark said, I'm Simon Argyle, I'm the Deputy Director that leads on European and better regulation issues, so bringing a number of themes together across the TFT interest. So first of all, I'd like to touch on the title of this event, Working Together to Drive Down International Transport Carbon Emissions. It's the working together, as Mark alluded to, that's a real issue here. We're not going to achieve this domestically. We need to work together globally to really try and make headwinds against this real issue, which we all recognise with. I think at the moment we're set against a difficult context, and we have been since 2016, namely obviously Brexit, which started it. We've been through a process there, but obviously COVID, the global pandemic, cost of living crisis, and now war in Europe. So what we're seeing at the moment is a bit of a scramble for energy. particularly with Russian gas supplies, forming a large part of that picture previously, and as we head into the winter, obviously the UK not as reliant on that as others, but we're looking at the whole energy system within Europe, and obviously that has an impact on transport. Now the key thing here is, this is probably likely to be short term, but it mustn't disrupt those longer term green goals that we're all focused upon. I think, just looking back, COP26, obviously there was a lot of chatter at the time, has this really shifted the dial? I think just, look at some of the aspects that were agreed in COP26. We had a ZEV, a Zero Emission Vehicles Declaration, we had the Clydebank Declaration on green shipping corridors, and then the International Climate Aviation Coalition. So again, a number of different strands in really achieving that global approach. And it is tough. When you're operating globally, I think within any fora, it's tough to get a global, approach to the various challenges that are out there. But I think generally we can consider COP26 has been relatively successful in driving these issues forward. However, it's very easy to get agreement. It's then delivery, which is going to be the key, and actually really making those changes that we need to see come about. So in terms of COP26, talk about some of that in the UK. For us, what have we done? Well, on zero emission vehicles, we've effectively banned the internal combustion engine for sale from 2030. Obviously, hybrids by 2035. That's 5 years earlier than what the EU's current plans are. So again, I would just kind of throw in: is this a race to the bottom? Probably not. Just to go back to that kind of Brexit dialogue at the time. Secondly, UK leadership in global fora. We've just had the 41st ICAO Assembly, which adopted a long-term goal to try and hit net zero by 2050. Next year, we've got IMO, and again, we will need to address decarbonisation within the maritime sector, within that global fora. We are currently considering how our approach to doing that would be, but I would hope that we can work together with global partners, particularly the EU, in actually, showing those benefits of collective working to address the real issues of the day. I think through the ICAO process, our working relationship with the EU has been positive, and really was, critical to driving that global ambition and overall agreement. However, I think, when we looked at what our kind of transport plans are within DFT, we published the Transport Decarbonisation Plan last year. That ties in quite nicely with the EU Fit for 55. There's a lot of synergies between the two. We're dealing effectively with the same problems. The method might be a little bit different between the two, but this creates a space for dialogue. But as I said, this kind of draws us in, to our broader objectives, and we need to work with other global players to achieve these as well. It just isn't something that the UK, working with the EU, can achieve on its own. However, when we focus on international carbon emissions, we do need to look at what we can do domestically. And I know for many in the UK, local air quality is directly linked and a huge issue in its own right. Now, I spoke about ZEVs and what we were doing there, but we need to consider at the outset whether we need to take those journeys in the first place. So actually, for DFT, there's a lot of focus on cycling and walking. We've just established Active Travel England, which will drive that work forward. We're currently investing around £2 billion worth in active travel, and our aim is by 2030 that half of all journeys in cities and towns in the UK will be undertaken by walking or cycling. That's very, very ambitious, but we need to actually, put the money in and actually work to try and encourage those forms of transport. On public transport, we're investing £3 billion to deliver a national bus strategy. So again, trying to get people out of the cars and look at how we can actually make more integrated networks with bus networks at the centre, as well as expanding bus lanes. We're also looking at investing in R&D to consider alternative low-carbon fuels, the role of hydrogen. We're also got our Jet Zero strategy, which is looking at sustainable aviation fuels, and Hydrogen Hub at Teesside is another example of how we can, look ahead and look at other technologies to try and be part of that global mix and how we more generally decarbonise. As I said, it's the global context which is challenging, but we do need to work together to achieve this. I'll kind of leave it there, but back to you, Mark.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for that perspective from the UK's Department for Transport. I'm sure we'll be coming back to you, Simon, in the discussion session. Now, it gives me great pleasure to invite Julia to speak on behalf of T&E.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mark, and then to the forum to also having and inviting us as TNE to also share some of our ideas, concerns, and also recommendations for going forward. What a time to be alive. I think it seems to be crisis on crisis. You see that I'm sitting here in a scarf because I will not put the heating on, and I will not spend £1 for Putin's Russia if I can. So that's my personal touch. So what I would like to do in the next few minutes is maybe talk a little bit from our perspective as TNE, where we see currently the efforts to decarbonize transport, focusing on road transport, which is what I work on at the TNE, looking a bit at challenges, opportunities ahead, and some of the policies and cooperation that we see is needed. Transport activity, all activity post-COVID has really resumed. And we really see it in all the modeling we do now that transport emissions are up. You can see cars are back on the road, back to cities. We also see aviation emissions going up, especially following the summer, as people finally started all to travel again and go on holidays. What this shows is that we cannot rely on cataclysmic events and pandemics to achieve our long-term climate targets. We need to have structural measures that are put there by governments that include regulations, funding support, frameworks that really make sure that the big, really welcome commitments that we all make together are actually done on time. We were very much in support of the declaration that was made by dozens of governments, companies, investors, cities during the COP in Glasgow to go for 100% electric buses, vans, cars, and trucks by 2035. But what we see currently is that at least in Europe, we really are not on the right track to be getting there. At the moment, a lot is happening in China. In fact, 25% of all vehicles, light-duty vehicles sold there today already are electric. That's really impressive, and that's 4 years ahead of their own goals, in fact. US is really catching up fast. And the Inflation Reduction Act by Biden's administration was really a game changer. And today is a really new way of doing industrial policy and has resulted in so much commitment and investments going or being announced to the US. Of course, globally, this is all good news. We globally need to decarbonize transport. But for Europe, for the EU, for the UK, these are not good news. In fact, we just recently did analysis, which we'll publish next week, where we see that from January this year, the uptake of electric vehicles all across Europe and the UK has been stagnating. There's no regulatory driver, so it's stagnating at 11% of sales, where it was ever since December 2021, whereas in all the other countries, so of course we can say, well, it's a supply chain crunch, but in other countries where you have regulatory drive, in China, in the US, sales are going up, and in Europe, they are stagnating. So this is a concern, and I would like to really stress that we do not actually share, the anti-Chinese sentiment or anything about protectionism. Competition is great. Globalization is great. And for international decarbonization, we need affordable solutions. Global competition brings innovation, it brings scale, it brings prices coming down. But in Europe, we should just not be naive, and we should make sure that we are part of that global competition. We are part of that global pie in the entire, industrial sphere around clean, green technologies. But the current crisis and the situation today is also an opportunity. It's an opportunity because finally, we really see politicians across Europe waking up and putting in place real measures to actually wean ourselves off fossil fuel, in particular of foreign oil. And this is really great. So what governments can do today, what government policy can do, has been really redefined. And the massive amounts of funding, for example, have been channeled into renewables, hydrogen, batteries to scale this up across Europe, but also into things like renewables and into, changing some of the problems out there, for example, permitting. So things are moving quickly, finally today, to make Europe energy independent from the energy perspective. And in fact, what is great is that industrially, green technologies are just as much of an answer as they are environmentally, right? So electric vehicle is the best oil-free technology you can actually have. So what does this mean for policies going forward for Europe, the EU, the UK? One of the crucial and most important policy levers that we have in Europe across EU and in the UK are the supply side regulations. So we were very much looking forward under the previous UK government for the ZEV mandates. And we really, really hope that the current UK government does not delay that and come forward with ZEV mandates as soon as possible. In fact, when it comes to the ambition to go zero emission for road transport for 2035, the most important thing that we need to do to get there is to scale up supply of these vehicles. And with that, the entire value chain, charging, batteries, gradually in the 2020s. We cannot just wait and sit on our laurels, wait until 2030 and start then. It will be expensive and really painful. So putting in place frameworks now and policies is important. So ZEV mandates in the UK for 2024, 2027, 2030, going to 100 in 2035. And similarly, CO2 standards in Europe, where we are almost there, but we need to lock in that phase out in 2035 as soon as possible to give the signal to the entire global investments and industry ecosystem to prioritize Europe and not just be looking at China and the US for the future of these industries. There's many other policies that are important. We can do a lot more on corporate fleets, taxation. Cities are really at the heart of it and really accelerating all across on zero and low emission zones, not just to push electric vehicles, but also to push the entire change in the system, modal shift, not to use a car at all. The key policies to doing so is actually at the urban and local level, and cities can do that so much more. And so much is happening in the UK, and here it's also more a message of many to other actually European cities. What I wanted to finish on is a quick word on raw materials. So if you ask me what's the main challenge today to accelerate all that we want to accelerate, it's actually supply of resilient but also responsible raw materials. And this is where cooperation between the EU, the UK, and many like-minded countries like the US, Australia, Canada is paramount. We're about to put in place a great transparent standard in the EU, the battery passport under the battery regulation. But we can't do it alone. We can't create this market in the global competition. We don't even have resources. It will always, this for the foreseeable future, require global cooperation, require imports. And this is where joining forces, and I really call on the UK to adopt a similar battery passport quite soon, but joining forces with markets such as America, Australia, South Korea, to jointly create a transparent and sustainable market for critical raw materials will really help to scale it up faster, do it affordably, and pivot some of the countries from which we might want to diversify. So that's really where global cooperation for me is a priority to go next to secure the sustainable raw materials markets. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. Really appreciate the perspective that you've just shared with us from transport and the environment. I'm sure there's plenty of points there that we'll take up in the discussion. And as you quite rightly said, cities are very much at the heart of this challenge and indeed the solution. So it's very timely now to move over to Ian Catlow, who's the head of London's European office. It's a great pleasure, Ian, to introduce you.
No, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Julia, for the brilliant segue into my little session there. So yes, as you said, Mark, I'm based in Brussels, representing the Mayor of London and Transport for London, London's integrated transport authority. And before I sort of move on to direct transport things, I just want to put our approach in context, because transport decarbonisation in London is, of course, part of the Mayor's broader target of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2030. And this means a 90% cut in London's total emissions by then. And that means we have to reduce heat demand from buildings by around 40%. We have to retrofit hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses to make them more energy efficient. we will need to install over 2 million heat pumps in London and expand district heating, and see a very large expansion too of rooftop solar generation. And I mean, as a city, there are certain things we can do ourselves in terms of buying buses. Then we will only be buying electric buses from now on. We've established a number of programs, for example, on retrofitting buildings, which is using local, national, and EU funding to kickstart that process. And of course, we have a sort of influence through planning policy and through the enforcement of energy efficiency standards, for example. But of course, we rely heavily on the resources and cooperation of national government and of the 33 local authorities in London, as well as businesses and other stakeholders. So the 2030 target in terms of transport implies reducing vehicle kilometres driven in London by over a quarter. And this is in the context of a city which continues to grow. So, 20 years ago, when we first had a mayor and first set up Transport for London as an integrated transport authority, then the population of the city was around 7.2 million. It's now around 9 million. So, reducing vehicle activity, in that context is quite a challenge. But the building blocks for achieving that are contained in the Mayor's transport strategy, which as well as addressing climate change, also is attempting to improve air quality and road safety and overall make London an easier, safer and more pleasant place to move around. So the headline target in the Mayor's transport strategy is for 80% of trips to be made by public transport, walking or cycling by 2041, and ideally rather earlier than that. That means we have to invest a lot in public transport so that it's frequent, reliable and affordable. We're building many more high quality cycle lanes. We're expanding our ultra low emission zone so that only the cleanest vehicles can be used on London's roads. And of course, we're installing charging points at a rapid rate so that it's easy to use electric vehicles. Now, there's an important international element to all of that. I mean, in the first place, we're very keen to make sure we understand what international best practice is for sustainable urban mobility. And you can imagine it makes sense for us to talk to Amsterdam or Copenhagen about how they encourage and manage cycling in their cities, for example. But whether it's that or, talking to Paris or Berlin or New York about running metro systems or engaging with the freight haulage sector or electrifying buses, we can learn from others around the world and also contribute our experience. And we do this via various networks and associations such as Eurocities, which represents all the big cities in Europe, Polis, and UITP, which is the Global Public Transport Association. And in addition, there's the global C40 group of cities who are leaders in addressing climate change. And the C40 has a number of programs which make expertise and resources available to cities around the world. London was a founding member of the C40, again, going back 20 years, and our mayor, Sadiq Khan, is currently the chair. Now, all these organisations, these city associations and the C40 are feeding in to the global discussion on climate change. Local government has a kind of observer status in the COP process. And I think we believe that cities really have to be much more prominent as actors in national climate plans, because frankly, without climate action at local level, we're just not going to achieve those global targets. So I'll leave it there. I think that's my perspective on where we are. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ian, for sharing the perspective from London and absolutely making that point that we need action at all levels, not just national, indeed international, but at city level too, if we're going to make any progress to reach those targets that we all hold dear. Gives me great pleasure now to move over and introduce Robert Cook from the Railway Industry Association. Again, we want to stress intermodality, and I'm sure you'll be sharing us the perspective of the railway supply industry, Robert. So really look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Morning, and thanks, Mark. So good to be here. Yeah, I'm policy director at the Railway Industry Association, and we represent supply chain companies, about 350 businesses or so, that work right across the rail supply chain. But as you sort of said in your introduction, the importance of looking sort of internationally about this and cross-mode. I mean, many of these companies are working across several different countries, and indeed across different modes of transport. And I think that perspective isn't brought out enough in discussions. So I'm going to start by talking about a UK rail perspective, but then I want to sort of bring some wider reflections about the importance of thinking cross modes and wider economy. So I guess it's interesting, isn't it, that the UK has brought down carbon emissions about 40% since 1990, but there's been no overall reduction in transport emissions. And transport now emits more CO2 than the energy sector or industry. And I think its latest figures are around 27% of UK CO2 is from transport. Now, rail, by contrast, we've got about 9% of passenger miles travelled by rail, but only 1.4% of transport emissions. So actually, it's quite a small portion of the problem. And you could say, well, that's it. We don't need to think about rail anymore, move on and worry about other forms of transport. But I think that's to miss what is potentially an enormous opportunity for rail to be quite a big part of the solution to decarbonisation. So a 4% modal shift from passengers and freight would actually save more carbon than the rail sector's total emissions. And if you look at sort of freight, then per tonne kilometre, HGVs have 9 times the emissions of rail freight. So there's a huge opportunity there. I guess in terms of how do we exploit that? Well, I think it probably needs 2 things from a rail network to play a part in solving this problem. Firstly, actually capacity. If you're going to go for modal shift, you do need the capacity on the rail network. And that means you've got to go ahead with the big schemes like HS2, East West Rail, Northern Powerhouse Rail, that will open up that capacity and allow the network to keep growing, not just for passengers, but also for freight. And then there's also innovations in how we get best use out of capacity. And then there's also dealing with rail emissions. If you're going to put more capacity on the network, you do want to look at emissions. And electrification is your friend here. So there's a target for diesel-only trains to be gone by 2040, which is quite right. At the moment, only about 60% of the UK network is not electrified. So we're much less electrified than the rest of Europe, actually. And we're currently only electrifying at about half the rate that's needed to get rail to net zero by 2050. RIA has been calling for a rolling programme of electrification from the UK government, a long-term commitment. So we've had ups and downs with electrification in the UK, it's fair to say. It's been more expensive than it should have been. But a lot of this is the sort of seeds of that are sown in the way that it's planned and procured. So I think there's a lot here that we can learn from Europe. There's a great graph that shows how the UK has invested in rail electrification, which sort of yo-yos up and down over years. And some years it's huge amounts of expenditure, and others it's almost none. And plot against how the German economy has invested in electrification, which is not far off a steady line. So there are things that we can definitely do to bring the cost down and do this more efficiently and more effectively. Hydrogen and battery are going to play a significant part as well. They're not going to be the mainstay of zero carbon railway, simply because of the sort of energy efficiency of those forms when you're converting energy into hydrogen or battery. But there will be parts of the network where electrification isn't going to be cost effective, and you are going to need those technologies as well. There are some quick wins. So the traction decarbonisation network strategy that is out there for the UK, actually, if you were to take just 10% of the recommended electrification, that could mean that 70% of UK freight traffic is on electric rail. So there are definitely some early investments that you can make that have a disproportionately big effect. And of course, anything that we do well in advance of 2050 takes carbon out of the atmosphere sooner, so that's worth doing. I think it's also really important that we take a sort of macro perspective and a very data-led perspective. So it's important to look at the embedded carbon when we are investing in these schemes. That requires innovation in the way that infrastructure is built. But also, the figures I've seen suggest that on electrification schemes, embedded carbon costs of putting in the electrification would actually be paid back in 4 years. So it really does look like a very good investment. So that's a sort of quite specific rail and perspective. I just wanted to end on a couple of points, sort of wider perspective. I think it's really important to be clear that, other forms of transport are not the enemy. Carbon is the common enemy here. We all know that when we're traveling, we like to take different, walk to the train station or, catch a bus at the other end or cycle. I think that sort of modal shift I've been talking about absolutely depends on having joined up cross-modal thinking about how people plan and take journeys. That's incredibly important. I think the city regions have probably led the way on that thinking within the UK in terms of integrated journey planning, and they've been given the levers to do that. I still think there's probably further to go in terms of cross-modal freight strategy. Something that would make a very big difference is, the UK is working towards a long-term strategy for rail. We need that for rail and for wider transport. And there's also roles that new technology can play in making sure passengers can take a sort of more integrated approach to planning journeys. I've already mentioned the importance of kind of learning from Europe about the sort of combination, what Germany's doing electrification compared to the UK. There's other areas we can look at in terms of what workforce skills we're going to need. It's broadly the same workforce we're drawing on. The projects are happening in different countries. What qualifications are going to be needed? Can we standardize across that? And then I think there's the sort of political piece, which is in common across so many different countries across Europe in the moment. Obviously, there's what's happened post-pandemic. I think there were naysayers who said, this is the end of rail. People are going to stop traveling from commuting. And actually, what we've seen has been almost the opposite. So freight traffic recovered by a year ago to pre-pandemic levels. Passenger traffic is now back to 85 to 95% of pre-pandemic levels. And going into the pandemic, that was the second highest, level of rail usage that we've seen on record. So I think we should be very positive and proud of that. And obviously, there's more scope to promote it, and we should be doing everything we can about that. And then the final point I just wanted to reflect on was kind of where the political debate is going. So there has been a strong political consensus, I think, for investment in net zero, but we can't let up the pressure on that. And it's interesting to see the debate in the UK about there's going to be very clear sort of spending pressures coming up this autumn. I think it's incredibly important that commitments to invest in public transport infrastructure, in decarbonisation technologies are honoured. And not least because of the importance of that stability. It gives you the most efficient cost for doing all of these schemes. But some people are rightly saying, oh, I've lost lights here. We've had a power cut. There's no trade-off between growth and green investment, and that's the line we should be pushing. I'm now going to go and sort out my lighting. But thank you, Mark. I'll hand back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. Well, the lights may be going out in London, but you illuminated us with your wisdom. So thank you so much, Robert, for your intervention there, particularly from a rail perspective, but also making very good points on intermodality and indeed the need for international cooperation. Gives me, finally, last speaker in the panel, gives me great pleasure to invite Rachel to say a few words. Really interested to hear your perspective from Rolls-Royce on manufacturing, on aviation, and no doubt the international perspective as well. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Mark, and hopefully I can bring a slightly different perspective coming from industry to this conversation, but I'll keep it short so we can move into the discussion. I'm conscious of the time. I just wanted to start with saying, and I think absolutely preaching to the converted here, but I think it's worth stating the obvious that transport is a really good thing for society. And we know that it connects goods and it connects people in a way that no other technology can. And I think to a statement that Robert said was that carbon is the enemy. And we are absolutely committed to making sure that transport is compatible with net zero carbon as we know it needs to be in the future. And from Rolls-Royce's perspective, we really are excited to be a part of that transition. I guess I should say Rolls-Royce is an OEM engine manufacturer serving aviation, shipping, marine, and off-highway heavy-duty vehicles. So operating across different modes of the transport sector, but committed across all of those different modes to reaching net zero carbon. And I'm really pleased that as an organisation we made a pretty bold statement 3 years ago now, 2019, to reach net zero carbon by 2050. One of the first transport OEMs to do so, one of the first aviation companies to do so at the time. And we fundamentally do believe that there is a technology-led transition to net zero carbon that can be achieved across all the different sectors that we serve. A combination of more efficient products, a combination of new fuels. Julia talked about SAF, sustainable aviation fuels for aviation, but sustainable fuels across different transport modes. And also looking at novel technologies, electrification, hybrid, as Robert was talking about for the rail industry, hydrogen as a fuel. So lots of exciting different solutions that are available. And one of the things that we're really clear on is that what we will need is a combination of all of those to serve different markets around the world, to serve different transport modes. But ultimately, we do fundamentally believe that technology can lead the way, but technology cannot exist in isolation. It needs to be supported by a policy landscape that is complementary, that enables companies like ourselves to bring those innovations to the forefront and to scale them up and put them into commercial application. And I also just wanted to touch upon really briefly is that the topic of this conversation is around collaboration. And I think that's something that we absolutely see in the transport sector, is not least if we're looking at an individual transport mode. Rolls-Royce provides an engine that goes onto somebody else's platform, whether that's a ship, a truck, a train, or a plane. Somebody else then perhaps chooses how it's used, where it goes, what route it takes, the fuel that goes in it. And ultimately, it's consumers, it's passengers, or those that pay for freight that can make some of those choices as well, can dictate where they're going to spend their money, what options they're going to choose for. And that's why I think it's so important that we think about transport holistically in every part of the system together, and that's across modes, but also across the transport system as a whole. So it's so important that we think about this in terms of different contexts, both local, regional, and global, because I think one of the things we're also really conscious of, if we don't maintain that global perspective, is the risk of carbon leakage from the transport sector to different nation states, different regions, if we were to, for example, work in isolation between the UK and Europe. I'll leave it there, so we've got 20 minutes for discussions.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing your perspective, particularly those issues of integration, global perspective, and innovation too. She'll be coming back to those points in the chat function. Obviously, we're getting some questions in, but whilst we're waiting for those to come through, maybe just go back to some of the points that were made in the interventions about how can we move some of these incredible challenges forward. I think Julia said, and I think we've all agreed, that we can't just wait. We've got great ambitions, great deliverable targets set for, say, 2030, 2035, 2050, but we can't wait until that date before we take action. And we need clear supply side regulation and reform and investment and innovation. And I think the concern is that we're because of the other global geopolitical challenges, we're just going to drift for a couple of years, which we really can't afford to do. So how can we bring back the focus ahead of COP27, colleagues, friends, panelists, to make sure we do maintain that momentum? Maybe if we work backwards, if that's okay. So maybe start off with you, Rachel. As we said, we're speaking to the converted, if you like, on this panel, but how can we galvanize action from the rest of civil society, industry, and governments globally?
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point around COP27. I had the pleasure of attending COP26 and speaking about the technology-led transition of the transport sector. I look at the agenda for COP27 and there isn't the same focus on transport at any level, which I think is really disappointing, actually, following on from the successes at COP26 that we talked about at the very, very start. I think there is an intention that COP28 perhaps will focus more on transport, but that's a whole year away. As you said, we can't wait. From Rolls-Royce's perspective, I think it's worth recognizing that some of the technologies that we've all talked about and that we all see as being necessary for the transition are readily available today. We have proven, for example, that our aero engines are ready to run on 100% sustainable aviation fuels. We've done that successfully on our test beds and in flight as well. Regulation means that we can't, and the just shortage of supply. We have a hybrid train running here in the UK on the Chilterns railway line. Again, proven technology. Just this barriers around scale up and affordability, which is where I think policy needs to work hand in hand with industry to bring these solutions to the forefront.
Thanks, Rachel. And again, just a reminder to everyone, please submit your questions via the platform. We'll very much welcome your interventions, your comments, your questions, which we'll put directly to the panel. But back to Robert, if I may, overcoming the hurdles in the short term to maintain the momentum, say from COP26, as Rachel said, appears to be very little focus on transport at COP27, which is deeply disturbing for many of us. I mean, many of us felt COP26 wasn't looking too good to begin with. It got better. We intervened with the COP presidency. Thanks to the efforts of DFT and Grant Shapps, we've got a much bolder commitment to intermodality on the agenda, but very little, it looks like, at COP27. Robert, any thoughts on overcoming those hurdles?
It can be tricky, can't it? I mean, I think it's really key to pitch arguments in that land with the sort of where the political debate is going, and it's quite interesting to see both political parties repositioning themselves since the change of government in the UK. I think the right money is on arguments that demonstrate this is all about opportunity and not about cost. Governments right across Europe are desperate in terms of needing to boost growth. What COVID and then Ukraine is doing to budgets and the fiscal situation absolutely means that you've got a cost of living crisis as well as a fiscal crisis, which is really difficult. But the way out of that has to be investment in new technologies and good jobs. And then, as Rachel was saying, transport, it's something that connects people. It galvanizes economies. When you build a new station, the ability for that to be transformative for a local community, for not just transport, but as a hub for people to come together and shop or whatever else, is really significant. And there's no shortage of evidence about this either. Both kind of local studies, and we published research a couple of years ago that showed that UK Rail contributes something like 43 billion to the economy, 700,000 jobs, 14 billion of tax revenue. These new technologies will only do more to bring that out. So I think the idea that this is a kind of afterthought and because we ought to be worrying about carbon is kind of almost the wrong argument to attract the politicians. So to build the cross-party consensus, we absolutely need to be talking about all the opportunities this will bring, rather than focusing on the cost side, because ultimately this investment will pay itself back many times over.
Thanks, Robert, for that positive perspective on the challenges. Ian, any thoughts on overcoming the hurdles, particularly to deliver short term, which I know is something, you've got an incredibly ambitious program in London. What hurdles do you think that need to be removed for you to be able to deliver those commitments?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I just wanted to reflect really on the role of public transport in all this, because, I mean, in a sense, I think we need to go back to basics. There are some actual simple things we can do fairly quickly, in London and in other cities around the world, which is, provide more buses. Just get more buses out there, and make them reliable and frequent and affordable, and people will use them. And at the same time, you want to have some sticks which reduce car use as well. I mean, whether that's through some kind of charging system or through low emission zones and so on. And these can have a relatively quick effect, as we demonstrated. I mean, in the 10 years after we had a mayor and established Transport for London, introduced the congestion charge, increased bus services, then we saw a 10 percentage point shift away from vehicle use to public transport, walking and cycling. So you can do these things in the space of a few years, but it does require resource and capacity and expertise, but it also needs policymakers to focus on this. And I always thought it was very striking that when the EU came out with the first Green Deal document in the early days of this first commission, public transport was hardly mentioned in the first document they produced. And it just basically said, well, public transport needs to be better. Well, I think it needs a lot more focus than that, really. I agree that in the COP process, it's also not been a major focus. One thing that I have noticed about COP27 is that the new presidency, the COP27 presidency, and UN Habitat are launching an initiative on urban resilience. And I mean, this is more broad than just addressing emissions. It's also about how you deal with the consequences of climate change and making cities more resilient so they're able to withstand, the extreme weather events and so on, which of course are now becoming more frequent. And this so-called surge initiative, deals with buildings and housing and energy and water and waste, but also there's a track in that on urban mobility, and the target there, or the aim there, is to accelerate and support the uptake of public transport globally in cities and active mobility use, and to reduce car use, and also to improve planning and coordination systems within cities, so that cities are better planned and organized, so that public transport can be used and you don't get the generating demand for car use. So there are some good things happening, but of course the global climate discussion is huge and complicated, and there's, as I say, I think that we need to focus on some basic things like public transport. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ian, for some ideas, particularly on public transport and buses. Julia, any perspectives on some short-term impactful wins that we can deliver on the ground to perhaps give people a bit of cause for optimism? As Robert was saying, we should be optimistic about this challenge rather than becoming cynical and just give up. So what can be done in the short term? I mean, we've all been discussing, time is running out almost, and you said yourself emissions are rising again. What do you think, what is possible out there? What could governments in Europe, UK, globally do now?
Yes. So maybe I'll highlight two things. First of all, I very much agree with Ian. Go back to the basics: public transport, buses, rail. The project in Germany was very successful. It also underscored the subsidized rail ticket of €9, but it also, of course, underscored that we need investment and improvement of the network, like Robert was saying. So this is important. I would say that within that, there are actually a lot of short-term measures we can take right now. Some people say, the best cure for high prices are high prices. So that means that there's natural waste that we can get out of our inefficient transport system via high prices. Fuel tax rebates and reductions is a bad policy. It induces unnecessary wasteful usage of cars, for example. In fact, it's a myth that people on low income all are there driving cars. Most really, sorry to use this word, poor drivers, poor people do not have a car. They do not actually drive. They use public transport. So supporting public transport is the best thing we can do right now for really low-income households. Middle-income households can do a lot more to cut out some of the inefficient car use and go and use public transport more. And as a result, within our economy, we will reduce our oil consumption quickly, and we will cushion actually a lot of drivers against high prices. So that's really important short-term measure. Better public transport and no fuel tax cuts. Instead, targeted support. So, for example, cash checks to low-income households is what's necessary, but no blank fuel tax cuts. Sorry for stressing this so much. So that's one short-term measure. There's also a few similar quick wins we can do on trucks, by, for example, installing some of the trailer efficiency things like flaps, for example. They just cut your oil use by up to 5% with minimum investments. And within trucking industry, there's loads of diesel use, and it can really cut diesel use by a lot with something as simple as slight addition to your diesel truck. The second really big thing that I'd like to mention is it's really important to underscore that current cost of living crisis, inflation, is making electric vehicles unaffordable for the bigger kind of mass market of people out there. And we need to recognize that, and we need to do and address that with smart measures. And here, some of the ideas that, for example, France is thinking of is a really good idea. So we need to have measures that are targeted at ensuring equitable access for lower income people to electric vehicles, supporting second-hand purchases of electric vehicles, doing things such as what France plans to do, what is called social leasing. So you actually, most people today, certainly in the UK and all across Western markets, actually are not buying outright the vehicles, right? They are buying them on leasing, so monthly payments. So subsidizing part of that monthly payment so that the price you pay for your electric vehicle is the same as you would pay, for example, for an equivalent affordable than petrol car. So people would go and instead lease, clean models as opposed to petrol vehicles because of the price. Is a really smart policy. Where it's also good is that via that mechanism, you can also start to steer what vehicles your industry is producing. You can steer the size of them, you can steer the cost and so forth. So it's a really important public policy to ensure more equitable access to electric vehicles. So it will be two things right now, not to forget about social equity aspects, and back to the basics with public transport.
Well, thanks so much, Julia, for those two really good ideas that could make a very fast impact, which is what we need. Do invite members of the audience to submit your questions, your comments. We'll be delighted to take them on board. Don't hold back. Do let us know, and we'll put those to the panel. Just returning to Simon, if I may, again, short term, but I mean, you actually set out, Simon, at the beginning, a pretty short-term commitment yourself that you want to phase out fossil fuel cars in the UK by 2030 and hybrids by 2035. I mean, it's 2023 next year. I mean, what more needs to be done, really, to, Julie made the point about, making it more accessible and affordable to move to electric vehicles. What more do you think needs to be done, Simon, to make sure those ambitious targets in the UK and elsewhere are turned into reality?
Thanks, Mark. Well, just on that question, I would say that we do realise that as government, the kind of rollout of charging structures is too slow. It needs to speed up. We need to see rapid charge networks in place to encourage the take up of EVs. We've already put out 950 million grants to try and build on this. So that's one initiative that we are doing. I think this kind of comes back to what I was saying. We need to see action. So if we look at COP and we look at the hiatus that you kind of alluded to, well, I've not really seen that in terms of the department. So my Secretary of State is very much focused on green growth. Well, the green agenda is right front and centre. I think we just need to be careful though, seeing COP has been the kind of the thing that does everything. It's at the end of the day, these are frameworks. These are politically agreed frameworks. How do you then turn that into action? I think again we can drive things forward in international organisations. I alluded to the work we're doing in ICAO. There's obviously trying to drive that ambition in IMO next year, but we need to have the frameworks of government to make sure that we're encouraging innovation. We're making sure that grants that government give are kind of targeted to the right sectors. Within the UK, we need to work collegiately with our development administration colleagues and our local authorities as well to make sure that we are taking a more holistic approach to actually delivering things on the ground. These things like the Tees Hydrogen Hub. They're good examples of where we can actually, foster these innovation and actually get a bottom-up approach going as well as a top-down approach. So I think, this looking to government for the answers isn't necessarily, yes, it works. We can, leverage these aspects, these ideas, particularly in the global setting. But we need all actors to be involved. Good comes back again. We need to work together, both internationally, but also domestically with industry, with innovation, and with others to really try and deliver some of these programs and understand what the crunch points are and try to address them, as is the case with EVs.
Thanks very much, Simon. Again, I'm sure we'll come back to you. We've had some good questions that have come in, quite challenging. Maybe I'll take these in two parts, but I invite you each to comment, but also maybe exchange views as well. I mean, one is the question was why no mention of biofuels for HGVs and shipping. I think actually, Rachel, you did mention in the context of aviation and sustainable aviation fuels. Just be good to get your view on the whole biofuel argument, which of course we know is contentious, but are we reaching a consensus on that? Because if we can't get a consensus on that soon, then again we're just delaying decisions for meeting our ambitious targets. And the second one is life cycle analysis. If we're going to move to electric vehicles of whatever form, are we taking into account the full environmental impact in terms of production of batteries or energy networks, electric grids, charging points? These are two pretty holistic points, but they are pretty important. So we actually don't create unintended consequences as we move to zero carbon, for example, at tailpipes. Anyone want to have a go at that? Perhaps, Rachel, if you want to start off on the whole SAF issue and biofuels. I mean, do you think, and it'd be good to get Julia and other comments on this, do you think we are close to getting a consensus at least on the way forward? Obviously, it has to be sustainable, it has to be regulated, because we really can't afford to have this issue dragging on, can we, much longer? So the role of biofuels.
Yeah, I think it's really good questions, and I actually think they're completely interrelated and hand in hand. I talked about sustainable fuels, so fuels for aviation, shipping, other applications, as a catch-all category. I appreciate, but what I'm talking about is fuels with an inherently lower life cycle CO2 footprint than the conventional kerosene or fossil fuels that we use today. And I'm pretty agnostic to where we use them and where they come from, to be perfectly honest, as long as they perform as we expect in the engine, and they are sustainable. And you're absolutely right, Mark, we need to have certification and standards around that. I'm a big fan of the use of LCAs to help to verify that, something that we're pushing for and continuing to use. And I think initiatives that can, in general, increase transparency, increase consistency of disclosure and calculations, methodologies around greenhouse gas emissions and life cycle impacts of the solutions that are available to us can help us as industry, us as policymakers, and ultimately us as consumers to make better informed choices. I've been quite heavily involved with the last few weeks in the work in the EU on the Count Emissions initiative, as an example. Absolutely a big advocate for what it's trying to achieve in terms of a common methodology for counting emissions across different transport modes. It's very difficult in practice to compare a plane to a ship to a bike to a bus, but that's what we need in order to enable people to make better informed choices and to be aware of not just the cost of, they have to be able to balance up cost, journey time, comfort, and emissions if we're going to help people to make more sustainable choices. So yeah, big fan of all that work. And I think just very specifically on biofuels, I think they're a stepping stone. I think e-fuels are going to be the longer term solution, but that obviously requires scale up of clean energy sources that can be used to create such fuels. So yeah, as I said right at the start in my intro, I think it's a myriad of different solutions for different parts of the market that we're going to need. All of them will play a role.
Thanks, Rachel. Really, really helpful and interesting. I know Julia and Simon are very keen to come in. Perhaps Julia first. Time is very, very short, Julia, so quick intervention on those challenging questions that we've been asked.
Sure. Quickly on biofuels. So within the definition of SAF, you of course have very different stuff. You can have genuinely renewable clean fuels, for example, synthetic kerosene made with renewables. You can have some advanced biofuels that can, in very complex processes can actually be genuinely sustainable. But the reality is that the amounts of those genuinely sustainable advanced fuels we can get and the costs are just not there. The scale is tiny, they're very inefficient, they're not really there to be at scale. So we need other alternatives like hydrogen, for example, in aviation. However, within that group of biofuels, the vast majority of biofuels today are food crops. It's things like rapeseed, soy, palm, and in the current environment, with the food prices as they are, with the cost of living crisis, burning food in our trucks just so we can have comfort travel for us is really, really unethical. So most biofuels simply don't match on either ethical concerns or environmental concerns to be part of the solution. And a really quick word on life cycle analysis. I'm a bit surprised by the questions because actually in the last 2 or 3 years, a number of academics and independent institutions, including Climate Change Committee in the UK, have really brought to light a really deep, robust life cycle analysis that all show that taking everything into account within road transport, battery electric is the best technology when it comes to life cycle. Next comes hydrogen, and after that, some renewable synthetic fuels. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Julia, for that intervention on those questions. Very, very quick interventions, if I may. And sorry, time is always running out on the, when we get going on these really interesting and very important topics. Ian, and then final word from Robert, if that's okay. Ian, a final word from you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very quickly from me, I think one other element I'd like to mention is just behaviour change. A lot of what has to happen now to make some progress is about changing people's behaviour and the way they live and move and work, and a lot of that I think can only be done at the local level. So I'll just leave it like that. Thank you very much.
And final word, Robert.
So very briefly on the biofuels point, scale, I totally agree, is going to be the issue. And I think you need clarity of strategy now so people can plan for what we need in 20, 30 years' time. We need to make the decisions now about which way the strategy is going. Life cycle analysis, transparency is key. People are talking about it. We just need to encourage more of that and a more open, honest, data-based, evidence-based debate.
Well, thanks very much. And can I just thank the panel for the tremendous contributions you've all made this morning to moving forward this important debate in trying to turn those commitments into deliverables on the ground by 2030, if not before, in many cases. And I think there's some clear themes there that we need a more international approach, we need a more intermodal approach, we need much more clarity, and it needs to be all connected up, local, city, regional, national, and international. And I think we'll all be going away to reflect on almost how we don't just need a decarbonisation ambition, we need a strategy within which it sits, and we can't just wait for COPs and ICAOs and IMOs, etc. We just need to join up the dots. So no doubt this hopefully will provoke more thinking at other events and other important milestones, politically and administratively, and within businesses that are coming up in the next few weeks and months. But just thank you all for joining. Thank also very much to all our viewers too, and look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks for your time. Have a good day.